Right, well, we're pleased today to be with my long-standing research collaborator and co-author, Dr. Sarah Jones, Associate Dean in the Faculty of Business and Law at the University of Northampton. Sarah, thanks ever so much for making time from your busy schedule to join us today.
Delighted to be here.
Kind of you. Um, I thought we'd start by talking a little bit about your own career and your motivation for research. You've spanned so many areas. You've worked in the private sector, you've worked in an advisory capacity, you've worked across the public sector, and obviously now in higher education in the academy. Um, could you just reflect on how all those varied experiences have shaped your interest in strategic pay research?
Yeah, so I think so. I came, as you rightly say, I came to academia from industry, and I had, as you say, various different positions. I suppose, most relevantly in the aviation sector, where I was working mostly with employee relations issues rather than reward at the time. And I guess I think that was really important for me, that I had that sort of practitioner background coming into it, and I naturally therefore saw any research or educational perspectives through that lens of practice and what it means in the real world, and I think that was really important for me. Um, I think some of my early experiences working in the field were, I suppose, driven partly, but what my learning was, I suppose, reflecting on it now, was that a lot of that has really informed my thinking about um, the organisational justice side of reward management and human resource management more generally. That seemed to me to be really key to understanding how people in organisations um, respond to organisational policies, practices, processes. Um, and I think that that's something that has sort of stayed with me, and informed what I wanted to look at in terms of research, but also, I guess, in my practice now as a senior manager in higher education. Um, I think that's really key for me. Um, yeah, I've had a long two careers really, I suppose. I don't think I'll have a third, but who knows? We'll see. It's always possible, isn't it? Um, but yeah, and where things are at the moment, the higher education sector is really challenging. Um, but on the other hand, there's, compared to when I went to university quite a long time ago now, um, we are a much more, with widening participation, we have many more people accessing higher education, and and crucially, accessing amazing careers, including in human resource management and reward management as a result. So, yeah.
I think that's a great way of contextualizing things. It's interesting that you refer back to industrial relations or employment relations, as they're so often referred to these days. And actually, for me, reward management as a practice emerged from that world. It was back, wasn't it, back in the 80s, where in the American universities, people with their MBAs, they needed something more than organizational behavior, and the whole notion of HRM as something strategic, and with it then thinking about compensation or reward. But at the end of the day, it's all about the employment relationship. I mean, one of the things that we absolutely cover in our book, isn't it, that it's about the way in which that effort reward bargain
Yeah.
is enacted. So I think it's really important to have that as a context.
Yeah, it is, and I think I've always been fascinated by that employment relationship, both as academic study and conceptualizing it, but also in practice, um, because people are people, have they respond in different ways, and for some people, it is very transactional. It is about, I do my job, I do what I need to do to earn some money that facilitates me living a lifestyle that I want to live broadly. And for others, it's a much deeper, almost emotional relationship. And certainly, when at various stages of my career having to do some of the more difficult human resource management scenarios, such as redundancy and dismissals and things, that emotion and that sort of feeling of a breach in that relationship is really key for some people. So I think that spectrum of relational to transactional is a really interesting one. And as you say, pay and reward plays an absolutely key role in that, and how that relationship is contextualized.
Yeah, and clearly, as you approached your research, you set out to challenge conventional wisdom, which is quite difficult. I mean, given that for all these issues around reward management continue absolutely in the contemporary environment, a lot of the frameworks that were laid down actually it takes one back quite a long way. The psychologists, the economists, the sociologists to a certain extent, indeed the industrial relations scholars that were laid those foundations, and in a way quite difficult when you're doing in-depth research, reviewing literature, to come up with things that are null. And yet it seems to me that your challenge was to say, well, this may be the contemporary wisdom, but I need to look at it in a different way. Is there something that you would say from your practical experience, particularly you've singled out that value of organisational justice as being a motivator? Is there something from that that led you to say, we really do need to look at this from a different angle to that seemed to have become conventional wisdom?
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's a I think there's a couple of things in that, and I think you're right. It on one hand, I think practitioners have perhaps benefited from the, I don't think strategization is a word, but making HRM and pay a more strategic, elevating it to, as you say, the sort of MBA level, um, managerial kind of thinking and strategic thinking. And I think for a lot of us working in the field, that meant it was taken more seriously. It stopped being a sort of, personnel welfare payroll issue, and it started being something that was seen as it's the professionalization of the people profession, um, which I think was helpful. But I think it also, and there's been lots written around this, I'm sure, but it also was a little bit of a gilded cage in a way. We were sort of held hostage a little bit by the fact that we had to do the strategy thing, and had to kind of put our money where our mouth was, and really, um and so, as you say, back to my research, really looking at, well, are there, what's going, the textbooks give us these wonderful frameworks around how, the best fit perspective of aligning your practices, your pay practices, with your business strategy, how you can compete in the marketplace, and if you do that, then you'll get these great outcomes. And I think it felt a little bit like a recipe, as a lot of these things do. You do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you'll come up with this glorious outcome. And um, and so it was ripe for the challenge. but it was also something, I think I was doing my research a little while ago, but some of these frameworks were back into the 80s, early 90s, and we were in a very, very different world. So I think it was a useful thing to challenge, but I think it was also useful, and I know I spent a lot of time during my research, as you said, looking at the literature, but because it pay and reward, which is one of the reasons it's so exciting and interesting to me, is that it is multidisciplinary. It touches so many different fields and different lenses that yes, it can be very easy to go down the rabbit hole, and and get stuck for days reading, yeah, stuff on econometrics and stuff that you really don't need to.
Well, and again, as I say, coming back to that very practical value set around organisational justice, that's something that obviously came to inform your thinking, maybe to challenge your
Yeah.
thinking. I don't know. I mean, was it something? I don't recall going back that was something you particularly went in saying you were motivated by. I'm going to look at organisational justice. Was that
No.
an emergent thing? Was it something that maybe surprised you even?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately some of the findings from my research were, I'm, I'm going to say, what I hoped to find to some extent was that, do you know, if you're fair to your if an organization is fair to its employees, if it properly recognizes their contribution through things like profit sharing, through things like really valuing, so and you've got those different dimensions there, haven't you? The profit sharing, which is the collective, but also valuing individual inputs and contributions. If they're doing that, then you get, my research showed, you get better HR outcomes, you get a better HR environment. People, there's not the pay discontent, there's not the absenteeism problems, and all of those other things that we kind of operationalized as measures for that. And on the other hand, if you pay low pay and you are secretive and don't consult on pay, as an organisation, you're likely to have much worse HR outcomes. It's to some extent, it's not rocket science, but it was great. It was I was very pleased that was how the data was telling that story really clearly, um, and that came back to that, for me, those basic principles of justice and fairness around how you treat people,
Mm.
and that again is back to our earlier sort of mention of the relationship, and it is a relationship, and it should be treated as one that needs to be handled carefully.
Mm, yes. Well, because it has such consequences, doesn't it? Not only in terms of the investment that an organisation makes in people, but what it actually communicates out, not only to the workforce, but everybody else that touches them, and the organisation.
Yeah, and absolutely, and I think particularly today, which was not never the case back in the kind of early 90s when some of these ideas were being put together. um, Social media has completely revolutionized that kind of customer experience, the transparency that many organizations have, and scrutiny that many organizations have to do about many decisions that they take, not just in terms of their external facing kind of corporate image, but their internal employer brand as well gets kind of tied up in that, and people
Mm.
will judge and be quick to judge on social media how those things pan
Yeah,
out.
with massive consequences. Brands can be diminished very quickly. Things that have taken decades, even longer, to build up. I mean, it's interesting when come back to the point that you made about thinking about this strategically, and in a way that having to come to the well, we're thinking about this relationship. Where does the strategy bit come in? And one tends to think, oh yes, that's what the MBA community do. It's about a corporate management, but actually it boils down, and we spell it out, don't we, in this subtitle to our book, alternatives or choices. They have consequences. You've got to put them into context. And it's just getting people to think in that different way. You've come up with a dynamic contingency model, and that's a really powerful original contribution that you've made to the literature, to thinking, to practice. It suggests that organizations have to navigate competing pressures when they make pay decisions. Could you say a bit more about that? And also, if you've got any examples from your own professional experience?
Yeah, so yeah, you're right, that sort of contingency model, and I think that was all about putting, we've often had conversations, haven't we, around context and how important that is, and the the environment that organisations are operating in, the size of organisation, the type of work that's done, and whether it is fairly sort of job based and transferable, or whether it is more more, there's more expertise and knowledge work going on. And I think the importance of context, to and understanding that context and being confident to lean into that context, and as you say, make those choices that need to be made. I suppose thinking about practice and advice, I think one area that I think fascinates me from my reflections on when I was an HR practitioner and in employment relations was and I've touched on it already, that the kind of the dichotomy between collective and individual reward. I think that's a really interesting area, and I've seen where the context was right, and this was in aviation, where a unionized collective workforce worked really closely with management. We didn't have a formal partnership agreement, but in all but name, it was a partnership, and it meant that the trade union group and us on the management side were able to not only set out really good sort of pay increases and pay rises, but also a number of different benefits around terms and conditions, for many of the staff, that the kind of facilities and healthcare provision and all sorts of different things that really made it, that were really valued to the individuals within that collective group. And I think that was really positive. And then I've seen, I would say, in higher education, collective negotiations that are done on a national scale, where individuals have so little input into what is happening, by and large, that it just feels something that's done to them. There's no, and there isn't that sense of being engaged with the process, for lots of different reasons, which we haven't got time to necessarily get into now. But I think that has meant that at an individual level, people don't necessarily feel valued and rewarded in the true sense. So you've kind of got, you've got these different contexts, and you've got these different areas, and something that can work brilliantly in one environment where certain choices are being made just doesn't work at all effectively. It works on some levels, clearly, but in terms of that individual engagement, it just doesn't work. So I think that's kind of these are the pressures that organisations are working in. And obviously, if you are in a unionised environment, there's a lot of pressures and constraints in terms of what you can and can't do.